and Council of Ministers and the LG has no power to act independently. Even in case of Aadhaar, Justice Sikri upheld the constitutionality of the Aadhaar Act but curtailed its wide ambit by striking down provisions which had allowed non-state parties to make Aadhaar mandatory. We are honored today, Your Lordship, by your gracious presence and Lordship agreeing to be the eminent speaker today. Lordship has always extended unconditional support to our college, and this is a reflection of Lordship's long and deep interest in academics. Lordship's very presence here indicates his commitment to go beyond traditional approaches to strengthen and inspire our younger generation lawyers and students. Lordship's decisions have always reflected his keen sense of justice and urged us to go beyond the accepted interpretations in law. It has always been a pleasure and great privilege for us to welcome your Lordship to our college once again. Honorable Lordship, on behalf of all present here, let me extend a very warm welcome to you as an eminent speaker in today's webinar. I extend a very warm welcome to all esteemed guests, members from bar and academia, students and other members. We are extremely thankful and highly obliged by your gracious presence in today's program. Welcome to all of you. I am sure that today's session would be a great platform for understanding, analyzing and deeper debates on one of the most important aspects of the rule of law in our country. With these words, let me welcome all of you once again to this webinar at Lloyd Law College. Thank you.
Sir, now I request Honorable Mr. Justice A.K. Sikri, sir, to kindly share your views on the topic Constitution and Constitutionalism. Please, sir.
Thank you, everybody. I thank the management of Lloyd's Law College, faculty, dear students, and even as I understand some lawyers also have joined. So all those who are hearing, are participating in this function today. And my first message to all of you is that in these difficult conditions, stay safe and God bless you all. I think we will soon come out of this pandemic and the lives would be again as normal as they used to be pre-COVID-19 period. At the same time, I must appreciate your college that even when we are in lockdown situation and confined to our houses where the movement is very limited, that you are spending the time organizing such webinars for the benefit of your students, your faculty, and even lawyers, etc. So, with these remarks, I come to today's topic, which is Constitution and Constitutionalism. Let me first give you a broad eye view of rather the way I am going to structure. I am doing for simple reason that the topic otherwise is too vast. If you know, if somebody has to write a commentary on the Constitution, it may take few volumes. And if you have written the literature, if you have seen the literature written on constitutionalism, again, plethora of literature would be available. Concisely, and in 40-45 minutes, express all that is not an easy task. So therefore, I thought that I should structure in such a way that the message which I want to give, insofar as this topic is concerned, I am able to at least convey that message. Everybody knows what the Constitution is, because I am not addressing to the laymen. You are all lawmen. Those either who are teaching law or who are studying law or those who have studied law and are practicing law. So therefore, and even normal persons, if you see the debates on the TV, or even I mean normal people talking, they would make a reference to constitution so many times. No, no, what you are doing or what the government is doing is not in accordance with constitution, etc. So all these things do come. So we may have some idea of constitution, but then in this constitution, what is this constitutionalism? And before that, how these constitutions came into being, what is the primary purpose of having such a constitution? So I would like to start with that. The origin, that means origin of democratic constitutions, and the journey, of course, I mean, I will not be very elaborate on that as time doesn't permit. Then I would say what are the features of a constitution which are to be there. And every constitution does not mean that it has the element of constitutionalism also. So therefore, what is the constitutionalism? What are those parameters? What are those facets? What are those features? What are those values of constitutionalism? And then at the end, I will say that achieving those attributes and values of constitutionalism in a constitution, what is the mechanism in any democracy, and what kind of mechanism is provided in our country, and how far that have been successful. So this is broadly is the scope of my address today to all of you. Now, starting from the beginning, constitution, as I said, of course, constitution can be, it's not necessary when we talk of constitution, we have in mind our Constitution of India. But any document which governs a particular organization can be called constitution, or is called constitution. We know we have clubs, and we know those clubs have their constitution. Likewise, any other institution may be having constitution, but we are not talking of those constitutions. We are talking of a constitution of a country. And the country means here nation state, because different countries will have different constitution. They may have different provisions and different kinds of democratic system, the system of governance. It may be a parliamentary democracy, it may be a presidential democracy, etc. So depending on that, the provisions of constitution would also be different. But then how, as I said, the first thing is that how this concept of constitution came into being. This is necessary to understand the constitutionalism, and that's why I'm addressing this aspect. For this purpose, I'm going to the theory which was propounded by Thomas Hobbes. And he propounded the theory of social contract. He said that, look, when there were no societies, in the beginning, the people, we were all nomads, our ancestors were nomads, they used to roam about from one place to other, they were all hunters and would feed themselves from that hunting they would take place, or maybe some fruits, etc., which are there, and that too wild fruits which are there on the trees. About 10,000 years ago, the humankind started, that they learned agriculture, that okay, we can produce this agriculture and this our food stock, etc., and agriculture started. At that time also, with that, they no longer remain nomads. They started settling at different places. Normally these places used to be near rivers, etc., because for agriculture purpose they need water. So there were no irrigation systems, etc., in the beginning. So this is how they started. And when they they were living in that place, that they came in contact with each other, but then there were no organized societies even at that time. So therefore, what was when you come into contact with each other, then this was somebody is doing some activity, some other person may disrupt that activity. There was a sense of insecurity. There was a rule of dominance, which we now call, we give that rule of jungle, we say, or might is right. And and so therefore, one person, in order to deprive the other person who is a mighty, would even kill the other person. So life expectancy was very low. Thomas Hobbes called it a situation of warre, W-A-R-R-E, not war, which in other terms in today's English it can be called as anarchy. So it was anarchy, total anarchy. And so whenever people will live together, there would be fights. In the sense, there would be disputes. There are disputes even today in an organized society also. But today's disputes are settled through courts or by lawful means. But in those days, since there is no society and that there is no government of the society, so therefore these conflicts would be settled. With the battles only. But and therefore the nature of dominance was there. But at the same time, people were indulging in economic activities also. They were having some basic amenities also. So it is the nature, human nature, that we want peace. We want to live in peace, whether it is in those times or even today's time. And main reason in those days was they wanted peace because of fear of death. Now, it originated, which Thomas Hobbes says, the concept of a nation state, which he calls in his book. He doesn't call it nation state. The name of the book is Leviathan, and he calls it Leviathan state, or Commonwealth, or state, or Leviathan. And he says here, the purpose is, as we say, Commonwealth, people are coming together and they want that we, instead of fighting with each other, we give authority to one person or some set of people who would govern us, so that there is some law and order in the society. Now, only this, he said that this can be achieved, this was used to be achieved in, as you know the history also, in two ways. One, by acquisition. That means somebody would come, he would acquire, acquisition. You know, the manner in which, as we say in Indian history, only 1,000 years ago, the way people from other countries, they came and they conquered India and they started by acquisition and started ruling India, which went up to East India Company when British government came until 1947 when we became independent. Other, he said, is the Commonwealth by institution, which he was referring to, where the people come together and they give power to some, they create an institution and give power to that institution. Now, interesting in this thing was that he had not thought of this institution as only some men or one person. He was still conscious of the fact that even if people join together and give authority to one person or a group of persons, they can they can also become despotic. They can also become dictator. But then he said that this was still better than becoming enemy of one against each other every day and in living in that age of uncertainty and insecurity. So therefore, but then over a period of time, this is called, I would, if I say that, theory of social contract, that people are contracting between themselves by giving authority to somebody. Of course, there are certain flaws in this theory, and therefore the later political economists, political scientists improved upon this theory, and notable among them is Kelsen and Hart, which students may have read, or those who have read the jurisprudence must have heard these names. Now they said that, look, giving power to single person or group of person, it need not be persons. It should be maybe institution also. And in order to check the arbitrary power as well, we should have that which he called rule. We should have rule of recognition. That is a rule which should be formulated, which recognizes that power in that particular institution. So therefore, final decider will be the people, which will confer authority on that particular the particular one rule, and this is the rule of recognition. The rule of recognition initially was only thought that it can be some set of rules and some laws which can be passed, and on the basis of which the power is given. But over a period of time, and it happened particularly in this French Revolution. You know, at that time it was monarchy. At that, then when the French Revolution took place, when the citizens they revolted against that monarch because of the despotism of the monarch, the way the country was governed, the society at that time of people realized, and they realized the value of right of man also, that all men have their own rights as well. So not that if the power is given to somebody and as acquisition it is monarch or it may be dictator, but then when people have to give power, it should be rule of recognition. But why not that rule of recognition should be such which even binds the person who is ruling us? We give him power, we give that institution power to rule us, but that institution also should be subjected to some rule. And from there, it originated how that rule should be. Over a period of time, it gave rise to what we call today the instrument of governance, which is the Constitution. And in democratic setup, came to be because the Constitution can be written and it can be unwritten also. English, that is England, has witnessed a constitutional governance over a period of time in last 500, 1,000 years, ever since Magna Carta. But there is no written constitution as far as England is concerned. But then the basic rules, how the society is to be governed, how the people are to be governed, and the acts which are the legislations which are passed, that they taking roots into the democracy are there. So what is the democratic setup today? That again, we the people, social contract theory, we form a nation state. It is ultimately formed in the by an instrument called constitution that I'll come to. But if that nation is formed, where people say by election we will elect. In a democracy, it is elected government. They would rule us, but their rule would be again in what manner they had to rule. It should be governed by the instrument called the Constitution. And this Constitution would say that how the people are to be governed, and how even those who have to govern within the limits of those powers. And this is therefore the Constitution is in any state is treated as the highest law of the land, which is even called Grundnorm. And so this is the concept of a constitution in any given society. Now, Professor Casey Ware, he defines the constitution, the whole system, in quotes, the whole system of government of a country, the collection of rules which establish and regulate or govern the government. Now it is very important. It is a system of the government of a country, that is system of governance. The collection of rules, it mentions some rules by which the government is established. Therefore, when the constitution comes, if you know, translate it into the even Indian constitution. In 1947, we became independent. In 1950, constitution came. Thereafter, only in 1951, first general elections took place under the constitution. Of course, along with that, the People's Representative Acts, etc. were passed. That is a different thing to regulate day-to-day regulation. But the democratic principle is enshrined in the constitution. Based on that, the government is established, and then the government is what it governs, but according to the rules stated in the constitution. Now, Sir Ivor Jennings, he clarified, and rightly so, that as I have already told you, that it is not necessary to have written constitution if these attributes are there in any system, and it may be there by unwritten constitution as well. Now, if in that sense, if I say that here we are talking of constitutional democracy, there is a democracy, but it is governed by the constitution, and it is not a formal democracy where the government of majority rule is there. Of course, majority rule is there. Any political party which is, voted to power, that which wins the maximum seats, have a right to form the government. But then, along with that, it has to act, as I said, within the framework of the constitution. That is why Indian constitution, if you see, states, and one thing more, which was, I said, social contract theory, which remains the fundamentals of the creation of the society. And therefore, our constitution also says, it starts with the initial words, we the people. That means people are giving to themselves this constitution and hereby constitute this sovereign republic, etc., and give ourselves to this constitution. So republic, constitution, that is why we say, although we got independence in 1947, on 15th August 57, but we became republic on 26th January 1950 when this constitution was adopted. It's a republic state which was created on that day by this constitution. And as I said, Hart and Kelson, they said that, look, it is not necessarily been men. It can be creation of institution, and our Indian constitution creates those institutions. There are three institutions they are there. So one principle is that it should not remain in the hand of one, which Hobbes said. The other said that no, then that person, if all powers are with one, they can misuse those powers. So in order to ensure that power is not misused, the separation of powers principle is adopted by creating three institutions. First of all, not given to men, but institutions. Of course, institutions are governed by men. That's a different thing. And these institutions are legislature, executive, and the judiciary. So these institutions are created. These three are given, define their power. They work on the basis of separation of powers and within their means. The powers are also given to them. They can't exceed their powers. And there's also a provisions of checks and balances. So this is the instrument of governance, how the society is to be governed. But then the question is, when we are talking of constitution, of course, as I will demonstrate these attributes which I have told you, they become the attributes of constitutionalism also when I come to that. But then before that, what I am saying is, when we talk of constitution, constitution can be even a monarch who is ruling the country. He is a king. He can come out with a constitution and he'll say that it will be governed like this. So his constitution may not have all these attributes. Even a dictator, there are many countries which are soft dictatorship. In today's words, they're called democracies, but they're soft dictatorship. Constitutions are there also. But therefore, and we call many times these constitutions has different kinds of constitution which are described as rigid and flexible constitution. That means a constitution which is rigid, it cannot be amended at all. Flexible, which can be amended. Then we have supreme and subordinate constitution. That means a constitution which is supreme, like in India, but in other countries there may be a constitution which is not supreme. It is the king who is supreme or some other authority who is made supreme. Then republican and monarchical constitution. Our is republican constitution, but then monarchy still persists in some of the countries, and the constitution may recognize that monarchy and, as I said, make that monarch higher than the constitution in there. So therefore, there could be different kinds of constitution. And here comes that the constitution doesn't necessarily mean a good governance, although it's an instrument of governance, but we want good governance. And as I said, the entire theory, social contract theory, was based on, and why people wanted, in even Thomas Hobbes' theory also, they wanted to come together, that liberty to themselves is liberty. The people should have their own choice of how they want to live. And therefore, even if the person who is to govern them should not take away those liberties, should not take away their choice. And with liberty, many rights come, which I'll come to. And other aspect is that it should not become, that the power should not be exercised in an arbitrary manner. So therefore, in order to ensure all this, constitutionalism comes in a constitution. So if those aspects are there in a constitution, they are called the values of constitutionalism. And if I tell you this, it is described in a very interesting way by one Barnett, author in his book, Hilaire Barnett in Constitution and Administrative Law. He says 4 things. Number 1, and I'm quoting, that the exercise of power be within the legal limits conferred by Parliament on those with power. This is concept of intra vires, and that those who exercise power are accountable to law. So this is what we call in our terms rule of law, that they have to act, or the doctrine of intra vires or doctrine of ultra vires, that nobody can act beyond the powers which are given. So even a parliament cannot pass the law on a subject which is not in list 1 of 7 schedule to the constitution, because it enumerates those 97 subjects, and parliament has power to pass the law only on those subjects. Then list 2 is state legislature. The powers are given to the state. So parliament cannot legislate on a subject which is assigned to the state, and vice versa. Of course, list 3 is there, which is concurrent power, and both the state and center can enact the legislation subject to the rules of repugnancy, etc., Article 246, which you know. Now, that is one aspect. Second, what Barnett says is, the exercise of power, irrespective of legal authority, must conform to the notion of respect for the individual and the individual citizen's rights. This is what Thomas Hobbes' theory of liberty. And this is what is based citizen rights, etc., which in our constitution is that fundamental rights, the chapter on fundamental rights, and all those are human rights which are given to us. Third is that the powers conferred on institutions within a state, whether legislative, or judicial, be sufficiently dispersed between the various institutions so as to avoid abuse of power. This is separation of powers. And separation of powers is not only the 3 institutions have to work within their limits, they work, even they have check and balances on the other institution also, which becomes very, very important. And fourth thing, which Barnett says, the government in formulating the policy and the legislature in legitimatizing these policies is accountable to electorate on whose trust the power is held, because it is the electorate, that is the people who have elected them, so they are accountable to those electorate. This is where we call the people are sovereign. We the people have given ourselves this constitution, within which we are electing you, but you have to govern us within the limits of this. And we are sovereign, the people are sovereign, because we have brought you in the power. This power is only for 5 years in our system. It can be 4 years, it can be 3 years. Like American president, the term is 4 years. So therefore, after 5 years, you have to come back again to us, seek fresh mandate. If we put you back in power, only then you can rule. Only then you can rule. People have right to throw them out of. The voice is echoing. Throw a particular government out of power and elect another government. So these are, in a way, the facets of the constitutionalism. And what if I say in nutshell, these are called separation of powers, human rights, then liberty when we say, another human rights which is based on dignity, and another thing which comes, which I have not spelled out here in that Barnett, but that is also there, rights of minorities in a given constitution. And all this lead to what? They lead to one thing. That is, not only there is a good governance. Governance is good for the benefit of the people, where people have their freedom, they have their choice, they enjoy their fundamental rights. And this is called by the philosopher, legal philosopher, as described as the concept of limited government. The government is there, but limited by power, not absolute or untroubled power. And the main purpose is of this limited government that restrictions are imposed on the state or on those who govern not to exercise power in an arbitrary manner. As I develop on that, I'll go further. Here I am on the of the constitutionalism, but how it is to be done. Above all, if you see, runs a golden thread, that is rule of law, which is enshrined in the constitution, which says that everybody has to work within the framework of law. So this is what we call rule of law, or which is said that howsoever high you may be, law is above you, and that applies to everybody, whether he's the President of India or Prime Minister of India, or whether he's a peon in Lord's Law School. So therefore, there's rule of law, but then there's another aspect. This is this concept of constitutionalism, where I have stated all these attributes of constitutionalism which are there, of course, are very, very necessary, so that there's good governance and no abuse of powers by the governed. But then they recently in last few years, because they are normally treated as the for long time, that this is what the constitutionalism is. But political thinkers or the constitutional thinkers in recent times have seen another facet of, another side of the constitutionalism also, which is equally important, and that is what they say, and they call this what I have said up to now, which leads to limited government, as the negative constitutionalism. And the other facet is what they describe as positive constitutionalism. And now the positive aspects of the constitutionalism are, which are again, as I said, necessary, are social welfare, solidarity, economic equality, social justice. Now these are also stated in our preamble. Becomes the duty of any good government, and that is why, if you see, whenever elections take place, before election, political parties come with their manifestos. They say that, look, if we are elected, we will bring these kinds of reforms, we will take the country to the road of economic progress in these manner, we will bring the social justice, we will bring the equality, by how the marginalized section of the society, how the poor, how the illiterate, how those who are subjected to cruelty, like you can say scheduled castes or scheduled tribes, how they will be given their rights, how women will be given their rights, how disabled person will be given their right, and how social justice would be achieved. All these aspects become the aspects of positive constitutionalism, which I describe in these words: social welfare, solidarity, economic equality, and social justice. Now, in any good democracy or democratic constitution, both the constitutionalism and positive constitutionalism is required. Negative constitutionalism is required to guarantee individuals their rights, and positive constitutional is required for this, when the society acts, when the people act in a form of a society, in a social group, but a particular social group is to be given their rights, and all those groups which I have stated up to now. So therefore, both negative and positive aspect of constitutionalism are necessary for a vibrant democracy, and therefore essential elements of a good constitution. And this, they guarantee not only the protection of minorities, but then they also see that the power is spread and distributed within the institutions, and at the same time exercised for the welfare of the people of the state. Now, this is constitution and constitutionalism. If I say so, how it is to be achieved? Between the negative and positive aspects of constitutionalism lies the important aspect of constitutionalism, that is rule of law, which I indicated. rule of law is necessary not only to bring about the positive constitutionalism, but negative constitutionalism also. And then the next question which arises is, in the whole context, who is to ensure that this happens? Here, all the three institutions have to ensure. Parliament, that is legislature, because at state level it will be state legislature. So I say legislature, executive, and judiciary. But in our constitution, where all these attributes are there, because we have those positive constitutionalism also in the form of directive principles of state policy, how the state is supposed to act. So that is also there. And we have all three institutions and the manner in which their powers are also assigned and they have to work. But then Parliament or the legislature enacts the law, executive executes those laws, it makes the policies for the welfare of the people, for the implementation of various projects, etc., day-to-day governance, law and order, and other things, saving the people of the country from aggression from the outside. So it has to save us from the aggression outside and within also by maintaining law and order. These are all the functions of the executive. And third is judiciary, which is to enforce the law. In the Indian system, which is a system in few countries, like in America, which we adopted, and which is not in America, of course, this is that judicial review, which is available to the judiciary, is not only of the Executive Act, but of the Legislative Act also. In Britain, Parliament is supreme, that Parliament can make any law which cannot be challenged in the court of law. Parliament can enact any law. But in US and in India, that law can also be challenged before the judiciary if that law is unconstitutional, because we both have written constitution, unlike Britain. So therefore, if a law is made but it offends any fundamental right or any other constitutional right of a particular person, he can go to the court and challenge. And if the court finds that, the court can invalidate that law or that particular provision of law, which is called Judicial Review of Legislative Act. And Executive Act, that is day-to-day decisions which are taken by the government, awarding of 2G spectrum, coal licenses, etc., and any tenders which are awarded or any other actions which are taken, they can be challenged before the court of law. This is called judicial review of the administrative action or the executive action. And if it is also found to be wrong, it can be invalidated by the judiciary. So therefore, the three institutions are given the three separate powers, but at the helm of affairs, the affairs are such, it is the judiciary which is the final arbiter in deciding whether a particular law is right or wrong, or in deciding whether a particular executive action is right or wrong. So, and since that is the function given to the judiciary, it becomes the duty of the judiciary, because normally what would be seen that the judiciary is to decide the dispute which will come before the court. So dispute can be landlord-tenant dispute, dispute can be family dispute, dispute can be commercial dispute, so all those kinds of disputes can be there. But disputes relate to the constitution also, disputes relate to the, as I said, legislative action and executive action also, which are brought to the court. And if the power is exercised, is misused and exercised in an arbitrary manner, that can be challenged in a court. So therefore, the constitutional negative aspects of the constitutionalism, which I told you, are so important. It becomes the duty of the judiciary to uphold that. Likewise, as far as positive aspects of constitutionalism are concerned, of course, it is the first duty of the Parliament or the legislature to pass those laws for the welfare of these people. Duty of the executive to execute those laws or formulate those policy for the welfare of such people. But at the same time, it becomes a duty of the judiciary also, all the things of the government, to achieve the positive constitutionalism. Since ultimately these cases come to the court, it becomes a duty of the court. So therefore, what I say is in this, that the judiciary discharges two functions apart from the function of deciding the case, which are important in the context of constitutionalism. Number one, it is the duty of the judiciary to protect the constitution and the rule of law, or rather protect the democracy and the constitution and the by upholding the rule of law. I should rephrase it, to uphold the constitution and democracy by applying rule of law. And second, and by this we achieve the attributes of negative constitutionalism. And second, to bridge the gap between the law and the society by impelling the government and persuading them, and because this job has been assigned and has been discharged by the judiciary in so many ways in lifting the giving those judgment for the upliftment of the weaker section of the society, etc. also. So this job is called to bridge the gap between the law and the society by giving rights. If I give an example, the as far as women are concerned, right, that the protection at this workplaces against sexual harassment, Vishakha case, is an example of that. Transgender judgment, which was pointed out, by giving acknowledging the identity of the third gender and giving those rights, is again was done by achieved by the judiciary by that judgment. So it is bridging the gap between the law and the society by exercising positive constitutionalism. Ultimately, in both this sphere, law is made by the parliament, but the court said till the law is made, since these are fundamentals of any constitutionalism based on dignity, it will we mandated that it should be done till the time parliament makes the law. Now, so therefore these become, but now the question is, very important question which comes here, is that whether there is a constitutionally democratically elected government governed by the constitution, whether it is imperative or we have the, we can rest in peace. Rest in peace in the sense that we can remain peacefully. We take comfort in this, that now everything is all right. My answer is no. If you go to the history, Hitler was democratically elected, but he became dictator. Mussolini was elected in Italy, who became dictator in Italy. We have in last 15-20 years number of countries. I need not go into that for paucity of time. If you go the history in last 15-20 years. In India, what happened during emergency times? Indira Gandhi was elected. She was elected. She was governed by the constitution and she had a majority. But then since her election was set aside, which was a judgment of the High Court, so there were two ways open to her. Which one way she adopted, that she challenged the judgment in the Supreme Court. But then she should have waited for the verdict of the Supreme Court as to what Supreme Court says. But she wanted, and the other way was, okay, accept the judgment, treat her election as set aside, go back to the electorate again and have your election if you can be elected again. But she chose the third way. She declared emergency because Supreme Court did not give her the stay that she can continue as the Prime Minister. So she imposed the emergency, and in that emergency she suspended all fundamental rights, etc. So, and the attributes of the constitutionalism were given a go by. So therefore, even elected government, democratically elected government in a robust country governed by such a constitution which has all the element of constitutionalism may still become despotic. And here, as I said, the two roles which the judiciary has to perform, and the of course, on one hand is the civil society, a strong civil society, because sovereign are the people. But then that can't happen as far as election is concerned. Either they come to the streets and non-cooperation movement start, or they wait till next elections. But in the meantime, in the interregnum, when day-to-day things are happening, at that time it becomes a duty of the judiciary to uphold the constitution and the democracy. How Indian Supreme Court has done, it has succeeded in a large way, it has failed also at times. Like I gave the example in emergency, when the human rights were suspended and the people were taken in custody and the preventive detention writs were filed, though 9 high courts declared those preventive detention as illegal, but Supreme Court in ADM Jabalpur said that no, in emergency the human rights can be suspended. So that is even known today, known as dark period insofar as Indian judiciary is concerned, because Indian judiciary could not save the democracy during that period. But otherwise, apart from that, and some of the discussions which take place now and then, to which I'll come to, because in this limited time you can't discuss everything and all the things, but I'll end by just stating 2 or 3 things. We have Article 368 in the Constitution, which gives amending power to the Parliament. That although we gave ourselves this Constitution in 1950, but this Constitution, any provision can be amended under Article 368. So what happened? That is what Indira Gandhi did that during that emergency period by bringing 42nd Amendment, by taking that putting some of the legislation which will be passed, putting it in 9th schedule. 9th schedule will not be amenable to challenge, and therefore whatever laws are passed are final, in a way taking away the power of judicial review. But what happened, in order to ensure that this amending power is not misused, in the most celebrated case in Indian history is Keshwananda Bharati case in 1973, where the Supreme Court came out with the doctrine of basic features of the Constitution. It described those basic features, and these are all the features of a constitutionalism, if you say so. If you see, basic features are described: democracy, separation of powers, independence of judiciary, right to life, etc. So these 4 or 5 basic features are stated in that judgment, and the courts under 368, even if all the parliamentarians want to amend, they cannot amend these basic features of the Constitution, because they are the bedrock of our governing system. They cannot be changed. With this, the amending powers of the Parliament are controlled, so that they are not exercised in an arbitrary manner, and our essential elements of democracy or constitutionalism are not taken away. Other ways, there are so many other judgments, because for that each judgment there would be separate, lecture would be needed. I cannot say, because I'm only on constitutionalism. The other methods which are adopted are one we call, and this is Keshwananda Bharati is also example of that, the silences of the Constitution. That there are many things which are not stated specifically in the Constitution, but the constitutional morality, and that is another concept which is used by the Supreme Court, that there is some morality in the Constitution, inherent morality of a democracy in a Constitution, which everyone has to follow and adhere to. And those are the principles which are adopted in order to give human rights or fundamental rights a wide, expansive definition or extensive scope, and widen the scope. The court came out with the concept of dignity, that most of these rights are based on dignity. Article 21 of the Constitution simply says nobody shall be deprived of his life and liberty except by process of law. Now, life is read into it in normal course. If somebody reads this, he may say that it relates to that my life shall not be taken away, that the nobody has right to take away my life except by course of law. That means if I have committed some crime, say some murder, and in the by court of law, it is established that yes, I have committed that murder, and the court pronounces the sentence of death. Liberty, if the court pronounces a sentence of 2 years, 3 years for some other crime, and therefore my liberty is taken away, otherwise it cannot be taken away. But Article 21 is not read like that. The word life is given such a wider communication. They said that it shows that the person has right to live his life, and life doesn't mean living like an animal existence. This life should be life, decent life, living the life, a dignified life in a dignified manner, and it's based on the concept of dignity. And only on this concept of dignity, although word dignity is nowhere in the constitution, in fundamental rights, except in the preamble, the word dignity comes once. But it is read into Article 21, it is read into a right to privacy when dignity is there, right into Article 14 and 19 also. And on that basis, only under Article 21, human rights, 40 kinds of rights are created by the Supreme Court, which gives so many. And today, if this is happening, the court hearing was today also. Of course, Supreme Court took that notice very late insofar as migrant labor because of the COVID-19 is concerned. Otherwise, it may be a matter of policy for the government how to deal with this laborers, migrant laborers after but then right to live life with dignity comes into it, with this kicks in, and it becomes a right under Article 21, and therefore court has right to step in and take stock of the situation of the migrant labor. It is under this that the court could talk about the, begar, etc., and those bonded labor, all those judgments were given. It is under this that the rights which are given to the even those who are inmates in jail, that doesn't mean that they have to live indignified life in the jails. So those persons who are accused of crimes, they also have to enjoy certain rights. It is under this dignity that the women are given their rights. It is on this dignity that transgenders are given their rights. It is this dignity under which the persons who are suffering from disabilities, etc., are given their rights. So all these are the attributes of constitutionalism, and these are the ways of two, as I said, two functions, main functions of the judiciary. One, to protect the constitution and the democracy, to take care of negative constitutionalism, and secondly, to bridge the gap between the law and the society, to take care of the positive constitutionalism and the other methods which are adopted from time to time to achieve that by interpretative process, which I have disclosed. So this is my, in limited time, I can say about this topic on law and constitution and constitutionalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for giving such an enlightening lecture on the topic constitution and constitutionalism, and also telling us about who is responsible to ensure whether this concept of constitutionalism is being followed or not. With your permission, Your Lordship, can we take few questions? So there is one question from Ms. Nistha Sharma. She is asking if we have to define or differentiate between constitution and constitutionalism in one or two lines. So what that would be?
In one or two lines, what I say, constitution is the instrument of governance of any society or any nation state, and constitutionalism is the heart and soul of that constitution, which leads us to the better governance of that society. All those attributes which leads to better governance. In two sentences, I can say like this.
Sir, there is one question from Mr. Sumit Kumar. He's asking that the Constituent Assembly has made the constitution and it has given the power to the parliament to amend the constitution. So in the same line, and obviously the doctrine of basic structure is there, that has been evolved by the Supreme Court, that parliament cannot amend the basic structure of Indian constitution. So he has asked that, let me rephrase it. He is asking basically that can preamble be amended, and is the preamble part of basic structure?
See, in a way, preamble is, what is preamble? Of course, preamble has much importance insofar as Indian constitution is concerned, which can be taken aid of while interpreting various provisions of the constitution, and it depicts what is contained in the constitution in that way. It is the mirror of the entire constitution and can be treated as soul of the constitution also. At the same time, we know that this preamble was amended. The amending of preamble or amending of any provision is not the issue. Amendment in a manner which offends the basic structure would be the issue. So whether it was amended earlier also, once it is socialist, the word which was added by amendment. So and that amendment still remains. Other 42nd amendment was taken away by 44th and 43rd amendment, but not this. So therefore, what kind of amendment it would be, it would depend on that. If by amending the word, if I say, let me see where is my constitution. It starts, we the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. Right? Now word democratic is there. Word secular is there. Then it says to secure to its citizen justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. If we tinker with these, we take away that it is not a sovereign state. We take away it is not a secular. Of course, as I said, socialist was added. Socialist is only tomorrow if there's a change in that. And the way we govern, there's a change in that may happen. So at that time, we wanted a socialist country. Here it is socialist, not for social welfare, etc. If we look into that may be a different aspect. Of course, it may have that ramifications also. But then we cannot take away the word secular. If we do that, then it offends the basic feature, basic structure of the constitution. So therefore, in what way amendment would be made, that would be relevant.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one question from Mr. Netrik Bharadwaj. He's saying if we go by the rule of constitutionalism and rule of majority, then in recent times, there have been many instances where political party being in minority is able to continue a government through allegedly unfair practices. So his question is whether constitution enshrines or protects constitutionalism or it's vice versa, and how it's affected by such practices.
Only problem is, I tell you, in a constitutional democracy, or in a, where they elect their representatives, it is we call it majority rule. But then it may not happen in given circumstances because of multi-party system. If there are only two parties, which is likely in most of other countries, advanced countries, then these problems don't arise. But if there are more than one parties, then in actual practice, single party may not have majority. So therefore, but then it doesn't mean, there can be only two situations, that no necessarily a party should be only in majority and then it forms a government, then it will lead to fresh elections. Fresh election again, suppose that doesn't happen, for how far we will go? Because it is the will of the people. People are giving votes like this. They are not bringing one party to power by giving majority. So the other way is that if the parties join, 2 or 3 parties, and this is what we call coalition politics, and they want to form a government, then and that is recognized in one of the judgments by the Supreme Court, that this kind of it. So therefore, what they say, who govern, because this is what was quoted before us also when I said that in midnight that Karnataka election matter, and the first thing is the governor is supposed to call or the president in case of national election is supposed to call a particular party which is in majority. No problem, because the party is in the majority. If it is not in majority, then it is supposed to call that particular party which has the highest number of seats. But if there was pre-election alliance, because sometimes the two parties, like in state of UP, if you remember, the Samajwadi Party and BSP, they allied together even before the elections. They told but they could not still get the majority. That's a different thing. But if they align, then after the election, if they have they are the they have the maximum, either majority or maximum, then they will be invited. And third is, as I said, but then last is that if there is an alliance which comes up after the election, and they are able to show the majority, then they will be elected. So this is just to save the democracy. These things, these are the various methods which are adopted. At the same time, yes, what happens? The question which is put is that many times when one particular, because the party, a second party which is supporting one party may be a party in the form of government, formation of government, and or it may be a party just supporting from outside, may not become a part of government. Then if it is supporting only from outside, then the party which formed the government is naturally a minority government. But the second thing which is saying, many times now, therefore, even a minority government in such circumstances, this is the, in a way, called beauty of democracy or whatever, has a right to govern, has a right to form the government and has a right to govern. But while governing, if they do any such thing which is against any law or against the constitution, and that is what is constitutionalism, then the only course of action is open is to challenge those acts.
Right. Thank you,
These
sir.
are the checks and balances.
Sir, there is one question from Mr. Amit Pandey. His question is, when under the constitution, it is given that the president is part of both the legislature as well as executive. So how far can we ensure this separation of power?
No, but president is only a titular head. We know that also. President, what happens? President under the constitution has to act on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So ultimately, of course, that if one reads a judgment of celebrated judgment of the Justice Krishna and Shamsher Singh case, that under certain circumstances, President have his discretionary powers also, because when a question comes of the formation of the government, when everybody is claiming majority, etc., it is the governor or the president who has to exercise his discretion. Or when the question comes that a particular government in power has lost majority, whether it has lost majority or not, and some action is to be taken on that. All these are the circumstances where the president has to act in his discretion. But for these very limited discretion which is given to the president on day-to-day affairs of the government executive, it is the Council of Ministers. So therefore, president is a titular head, and therefore that's why treated as first citizen. In the sense, he is the supreme commander of three forces also. That doesn't mean when the war takes place, he goes to, he controls how the war is to be waged and how we have to formulate the strategy. But he is the supreme commander in that sense. So, but this is only a status which is given to. So, in a one form, it is status. In some other form, some powers are also given in order to ensure that the democracy works.
Right, sir. Sir, there is one question from a civil judge, Uttarakhand, Ms. Sanchi Agrawal. She is asking that how feasible will be all India Judicial Services examination when there is a norm for independence of judiciary?
You see, this is a matter of debate, and since she's a judicial officer,
pending matter.
Sanchi would be knowing it fully well. Yeah, pending matter is one thing, but in any case, I am not a sitting judge, therefore I can express my views. But I tell you very frankly, there are two views on that, and both appear to be equally strong. Up to now, states particularly, and state judiciary, I am including high government wants, as well as it is not only earlier, even Congress government wanted, even now BJP government also, they want that there should be all India judiciary, and there are some benefits of that. I remember when I was acting Chief Justice of Delhi High Court, at that time the law secretary from central government, from the Ministry of Law, he had come to me and wanted to discuss only this, that they were, going ahead with this concept of All India judiciary in a big way at that time, and they wanted to introduce, I'm talking of 2011, 10 I became this October 2010 I became acting Chief Justice, and so it was either 2010 and or early 2011, and government was in power till 2014, that particular government. So therefore they wanted at that time. So I told him, it's not a matter of discussion detail. This is a topic again which needs full-fledged discussion. But just to tell Sanchi about what she wants, that that there are some, reservations insofar as various high courts are concerned, and I told him those points. And question is, yes, there may be some good features if there is an all India judiciary. At the same time, these aspects which I'm saying, if they are taken care of, maybe all India judiciary may come into force, but otherwise it would be difficult. Having said so, for her benefit, if I say today, for whatever reason, Supreme Court seems to be little inclined, and it is not now. Even when I was judge of the High Court and Justice Kher was the Chief Justice, if she remembers, since she is a judicial officer, they had taken suo motu notice, and a bench was constituted for this purpose, and they wanted to pass a judicial order at that time for creation of all India judiciary. But then there was such a, fierce objection from the high courts that they could not proceed further. So that is where we stand.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one question. Just two more questions. From Ms. Shweta Sharma. She's asking, as the term secular is used in our preamble, is naming educational institutions after a religion, for example, the Hindu college, constitutionally valid?
There's no, problem in, you see, as far as minorities are concerned, Article 29, Article 30, they protect. We have Aligarh Muslim University, right? Of course, Hindu college, the word Hindu is there, and Hindu may be in majority, but minority 29, 30, they have a right. Giving the name and that itself doesn't become, Hindu college is by no means a college only for Hindus, or it is a religious, based on religious this thing. So merely giving by name, we have Banaras Hindu University, of course, which was both the, one thing is there that both, I'm not sure of Hindu college, but Banaras Hindu University is the pre-independence era. I'm not too sure whether this Hindu college was formed before 1950 or after. I think it may be, I'm not too sure. But I don't think there's any otherwise reason. But if you see it from other angle, from intellectual property angle, that if it is a trade name or the name and if you want to get it registered, of course, educational institutions are not treated as a trade. They are treated as profession, not commercial. It is said by the Supreme Court, it is not a commercial activity. But per se, I don't think that there should be any objection. But maybe today, if somebody wants to go and register in this name, there may be some objections. I can't.
So just last question. Many people are asking a question on this pandemic that in this present situation, if a people cannot be provided with the minimum basic facilities of food and shelter, could it be a situation where there is a violation of fundamental right guaranteed under Article 21 by the government, and can the courts or the authorities hold them responsible, hold the governing body concerned responsible for the violation?
Which violation?
Violation.
One is that this lockdown is ordered and I can't move out. It's the that.
No, sir, not providing food.
Or not providing food only.
Not providing food, sir.
You see, this is again, as I said earlier, a part of this directive principles of state policy. But at the same time, it is read into Article 21 and therefore has been brought on the pedestal of human rights. And there are 2-3 judgments earlier of the Supreme Court. That is why Supreme Court has taken cognizance of this. 2-3 judgments of the Supreme Court saying that right to food is a fundamental right. if you remember, way back in 2010, 11 or 11, 12, when the Supreme Court has said that there's so much of food with Food Corporation of India, which was going waste, etc. They said that there are so many hungry people. Why don't you distribute it to them? That Justice Justice who is the judge in Justice Bhandari. He gave that judgment, and then there was another judgment also 4 years ago or so. So therefore, and that is why I said that Supreme Court has taken cognizance of it, of course, belatedly and ultimately, but various high courts have taken. And question is that one is that they can force the government to provide for food, etc., and take suitable arrangement and ensure that everything is, I mean, they are given comforts of all in all possible ways. Other thing is, as you said, that tomorrow, suppose some action comes against the government, that it was your failure in the first instance, and then therefore you pay damages also to these migrant workers. So said in torts, but then access to justice, PIL on behalf of this migrant, somebody can file. Nobody has filed it so far, but suppose tomorrow somebody is filed and they said the government should compensate them with damages, because many people have died and many people who starved, etc., and had to undergo such a misery should be compensated. It would be creating a new jurisprudence, I would say. But let us see. I don't know. It has nobody has thought of it so far, but somebody may think of it. That many lawyers who are listening today may get an idea.
Thank you so much
for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Don't forget to click the bell button so you can get the notification for new video in future.